There's quite a bit of tragedy associated with Samuel's death in that remote Russian forest so many years ago.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. For most Australians, the story of the Anzacs ends in the mud of Gallipoli or the trenches of the Western Front. It's a story we know very well, a story of sacrifice, of endurance and nationhood forged in war. But what if I told you that that story didn't end in 1918? What if, just as the guns fell silent in Western Europe, a small group of Australians chose not to come straight home, but to fight on in a distant and unfamiliar land, and in a war that few Australians today have even heard of? Well, in 1919, more than 100 Australians volunteered to serve in the Russian Civil War. They were drawn into a conflict born of revolution, ideology, and, of course, imperial collapse. Now, this was not a war of clear alliances, but of shifting loyalties. And there was occasions when even supposed allies could not always be trusted. And yet, this is not simply a forgotten war. It is perhaps a war we choose to forget. It did not fit the Anzac story we tell ourselves. It was ambiguous, unresolved and uncomfortable. Well, my guest today is Damien Wright, a military historian who has dedicated his work to recovering this lost chapter of Australian history. And his research brings to light the extraordinary story of one of Australia's Victoria Cross recipients, Sergeant Samuel Pearse, whose remains remarkably still lie in Russia more than a century after his death. Damien, welcome to Afternoon Light. This is a fascinating story. I have really enjoyed learning about Australians in the Russian Civil War, and I am one of, no doubt, many Australians who had no idea that we were involved. What sparked your interest in the Russian Civil War? And I should say, as someone who works in history education in Australia, particularly in Victoria, there are history subjects offered at VCE level. There's Australian history, which we love here at the Menzies Institute, and there's revolutions. And of course, the Russian Revolution is highly featured in that, and it's really popular. So Australian kids do like learning about the Russian Revolution. But what led you to studying this period of history?
Good afternoon, Georgina. So when I was a young lad, on our wall in the house, we had a photograph of my grandfather in his Australian Light Horse uniform, and I became very interested in Anzac history. And for Christmas birthdays, I'd get Anzac history books. And when I was 16, I got a book which had a chronological list of all the Australian Victoria Cross recipients. Boer War, First World War, Second World War, Vietnam. And then between World War I and World War II, there were two strange awards, and it said North Russia 1919. And I'd never even heard of Australians in North Russia. And I tried to find out more, but I couldn't find anything about the campaign. This was before the days of the internet. And so it really piqued my interest. So I first became interested when I was about 16, which was in the last century, and first started seriously researching the campaign when I was 19. And so that's really how I became interested in it, because there was so little about it and virtually nothing could be found about this strange episode in Australian military history.
Can you take us back to Russia in 1917? There were effectively two revolutions, the collapse of the Tsarist regime and, of course, the murdering of the Tsar and his family, and then the rise of the Bolsheviks. How did that play out, and then how did Australia come to be involved?
Yeah, so Europe at the start of the First World War was a strange place in that the King George V of Great Britain, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany were all first cousins. So the Tsar of Russia has a very physical similarity to King George V. They look like brothers. Imperial Russia under the Tsar was in action in the First World War on the Eastern Front from the first day of the war, and they suffered huge casualties. I think 2 million casualties, 5 million prisoners of war, terrible, terrible casualties. The Russian Empire was very much an autocratic state. Russian peasants had only just really come out of being serfs, and there was a lot of disquiet and resentment and anger about how the war was being conducted. There were many terrible defeats of the Imperial Russian Army on the Eastern Front. There were shortages at home. The Imperial Russian Army was never really very well equipped. The peasant class were being asked to make huge sacrifices. There was shortages of food, and anti-government forces in Russia used that opportunity to ferment revolution, which ultimately led to the abdication of the Tsar. And 1917 was a year of revolution in Russia. After the Tsar abdicated, a provisional government was formed, which tried to introduce some democratic reforms, but that was also going to be difficult, if not impossible, in the political environment at the time. There was also an attempt by the generals to overthrow the government in July, and then finally in November 1917, there was a Bolshevik revolution led by Vladimir Lenin. And the Bolsheviks, which overthrew the provisional government and led to the establishment of the Soviet Union.
And to what extent do you think the sacrifices of Australians at Gallipoli were tied to support for Russia?
Yes, the whole purpose of the Gallipoli campaign was to knock Ottoman Turkey out of the war. They had joined the war on the side of the Germans and against the Russians. And access to the Black Sea meant that war supplies could be shipped to Russia. And the purpose was, if the Dardanelles could be conquered, access to the Black Sea could be established and Allied shipping would have access to the Black Sea ports. The Gallipoli campaign was a failure. The Dardanelles were not conquered, and that left only two avenues to supply Imperial Russia, to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. But that meant a huge epic train journey to the Eastern Front from Pacific Russia, or the Arctic ports of Murmansk and Archangel, which did not have the harbour facilities to be able to unload stores at the time, or a railway to ship the stores south. So very much the purpose of the Australian, New Zealand, British, French effort on the Gallipoli Peninsula was because of Imperial Russia being an ally in the First World War.
I mean, the Allies were angered, obviously, by the Bolsheviks to the extent that they thought it was worthwhile to get involved in the Civil War.
Yeah, so when the Provisional Government took power in March 1917, they continued the war on the Eastern Front. And it was not until the Bolshevik Revolution of November 1917, or October in the Orthodox calendar in Russia at the time, that Lenin took Russia out of the war, closed the Eastern Front, and in March 1918 signed a peace treaty with the Germans at Brest-Litovsk. So Germany and Austria-Hungary were able to remove all of their troops from the Eastern Front and send them to other fronts. And a number of German divisions were sent to France, where they took part in the Spring Offensive of March-April 1918, which for a short time threatened Paris. So the Allies considered it a huge betrayal on the behalf of Lenin to take Russia out of the war. Having been in the war since 1914, they were very hard-pressed on the Western Front, and they were desperate to install or help anti-Bolshevik forces within Russia to reinstall a government which would reopen the Eastern Front and take the pressure off the Western allies in France.
This geopolitical context is somewhat lost, I think, in the annals of history. It's often thought that Australia started its, global fight against the USSR, the Soviet Union, in the Cold War, post-World War II. But of course, we were fighting Soviets way, way before, weren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Serving Australian Army soldiers in Australian Army uniforms were in Russia fighting the Red Army before the establishment even of the Soviet Union in post-revolutionary Russia. So the history of Australians fighting communism goes right back to the very foundations of the Soviet Union, which, as you say, most Australians are not aware of.
What was the thinking around the Bolshevik Revolution in Australia? Was it in the media much? Was it discussed? Were people concerned? Obviously, 100 or so Australians were concerned enough to go and fight in the Russian Civil War, but more broadly speaking.
Yeah, it was huge international news, perhaps overshadowed somewhat by events on the Western Front in particular. But there were certainly left-leaning workers' unions and others in Australia that considered it to be a good thing. But yeah, there was a lot of uncertainty in Australia. I guess the establishment were very concerned about it and what it meant for any sort of revolutionary movements in Australia. But it perhaps took a back seat somewhat to events in Europe because it was still very uncertain what was going to happen with the First World War, and it was very much unknown how that war would end at the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917.
So tell me about Samuel Pearse. Who was he, this Victoria Cross recipient? We'll cover the rest of his story later, but where did he originate from? What brought him to the Russian Civil War?
Samuel Pearse was born in Wales to English parents and emigrated to Australia as a young boy and grew up in Mildura, in the irrigation farming settlement there. And at the start of the First World War, in 1915, enlisted in the Australian Army. He served on Gallipoli and the Western Front, where he was decorated for bravery. And at the end of the First World War, after November 1918, Australians were very low priority for shipping home. And so by spring of 1919, most of them were still waiting in staging camps in England, bored out of their brains with nothing to do. And the authorities were finding it difficult to keep them entertained. And the War Office put out a call for volunteers for the North Russia Relief Force, a force being sent to North Russia to relieve the British force that had been iced in over the winter in Archangel. And about 110 Australians volunteered, primarily for the financial benefits. They were offered 14 shillings a day as a private soldier, which was double the Australian pay. They would be able to continue to wear their Australian uniform, slouch hats and badges, and they would serve under Australian non-commissioned officers, sergeants and corporals, although their officers would be British. So they were also promised passenger transport home rather than a troop ship. So a number of Australians expressed interest, but only about 110 actually went through, voluntarily discharged from the Australian Army, enlisted in the British Army and went to fight in North Russia in the summer of 1919.
So these Australian soldiers who signed up, the 110, were basically signing up for financial reasons, was your view?
Some of them, based on some of the recorded reminiscences, were unsettled after the war. They weren't quite ready to go home. One chap in particular talks about exactly that. He felt unsettled after the war. He wasn't quite ready to go home. He'd read about Russia in school geography and he was curious to see it. For some of these men, they joined when they were 17, 18. They were now 22, 23, and they hadn't known anything else really in that adult life other than being in uniform, being in the war, the camaraderie and also the danger. And many of them probably didn't think they were going to survive the war given the casualty rates. So some were quite desperate to get home as soon as possible, and some that didn't have families saw it maybe as an opportunity to save a bit of money before going home or just to continue the familiarity of active service.
Of the 110, how many returned to Australia, Damien?
Some, unfortunately, Samuel Pearse in particular, I know I'm perhaps jumping ahead a little bit, but was not able to return to Australia. Others returned to England, married there and stayed in England, but virtually all of them did return to Australia. But because the war was over by the time they arrived, some of them were getting back in December 1919, January, February 1920. People were kind of over the war. So they didn't receive any particular welcome and most of them never saw each other again. And there was a newspaper article, I think it was from the 50s or 60s, about a reunion, but it was only 3 or 4 blokes who caught up at an Anzac Day. And so they virtually never saw each other again.
Yeah. It's amazing to think of the horrors of the Western Front and, of course, the tragedy of Gallipoli, that these 110 Australian soldiers would think, I've got another fight left in me. Yes, I'm going to get paid quite well, but the threat of, loss of life, the sacrifice, the very, very tough conditions that they inevitably were going to face in Russia, in northern Russia. It's just an incredible decision to make, don't you think? Especially as Australians particularly didn't necessarily have much skin in this game of a Russian civil war.
So the motivation was not ideological. There wasn't any motivation other than perhaps an opportunity to be paid very well, to stay with some mates, to continue to serve under their Australian identity. And I honestly don't think they knew they were going to take part in as much fighting as they did. I think that they were sold as it was going to be a relief force. They're going to do a bit of garrison duty, guarding some places, maybe a few skirmishes. But I don't think they actually knew or were recruited in the knowledge that they would be actively taking part in offensives, significant offensives against the Red Army in Russia. So I think they probably thought it wasn't going to be as dangerous as it actually was. And the alternative was to stay in the staging camps in England, and they were bored out of their brains. So I think many of them were so bored after being in camps for several months that they took any chance for a change of scenery.
Yeah. So
I think it was the adventurous spirit more than anything else.
Well, one adventurous spirit was, of course, Samuel Pearse, the Welsh-born Mildura boy who just couldn't get enough of the fight, clearly. But he certainly wasn't without attachments, was he? He had a romantic attachment, which, of course, in the end leads you to this fascinating story, as well as your interest in this mysterious VC winner or recipient. Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
So one of the conditions for Australian soldiers to be granted discharge in the UK to enlist in the British Army for North Russia was that they must be unmarried and have no children, no dependents. So Samuel Pearse got around that by discharging from the Australian Imperial Force, marrying, and then joining the British Army because there was no such restriction on the British Army. So 3 days after his wedding to his English sweetheart Kitty, he enlisted in the British Army for North Russia. And on the day that he sailed for North Russia, he received a letter advising that he was going to be a father, that Kitty was pregnant. So the letters survive from his correspondence with Kitty leading up to his death in battle. So what follows on from there is very much how I became involved in the story a century later.
Yeah, well, we'll get on to that a bit later. But there were other soldiers' stories you followed in your research, the story of Corporal Arthur Sullivan as well, who had arrived in Europe too late to take part in the First World War. So he hadn't been to Gallipoli in the Western Front. And so the Russian Civil War was at least the opportunity to be involved in some fighting that he otherwise had missed out on, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I did mention earlier that there were 2 Australian Victoria Crosses, which is quite remarkable because there were only 2 Victoria Crosses for the whole campaign on land in the Russian Civil War, and they both went to Australians out of the 110-man contingent, which is quite remarkable in itself. So the other contingent of volunteers, other than those that were perhaps unsettled or bored, were those that saw very little service at the end of the First World War or no service at all. So Arthur Sullivan was from Crystal Brook, South Australia, arrived in the UK in September, but did not get to France before 11th of November when the war ended. So having travelled to the other side of the world, being presented with a gold watch by the community when he was sent off, he, like other volunteers such as himself, likely felt guilty that he would be returning home without actually having seen active service. So the opportunity to volunteer for the British Army North Rush Relief Force was an opportunity to do just that, to see some active service, to see some shots fired in anger, and he would not be going home without having been in conflict or at war. So about 25-30% of the Australian volunteers fall into that category, that they had seen very little or no service during the war, and perhaps felt that the reflected glory of being an Anzac was something they would feel guilty about if they did not actually see active service, if they did have the opportunity.
So Samuel Pearse and Arthur Sullivan and 108 other Australians go off to the Russian Civil War. They end up in the northern part of Russia as part of the new North Russian Expeditionary Force. What were they tasked to do? They were fighting on the side of the White Russians against the Bolsheviks, the Red Russians, but it wasn't necessarily as predictable in terms of allegiances and loyalty as they perhaps would have experienced in World War I proper.
Yeah, so after the Bolshevik Revolution of November 1917, the country fractured into Revolutionary Red and Revolutionary White forces. So the White forces were approximately aligned with the old Tsarist regime, and the Red Forces approximately aligned with Lenin's Bolsheviks, although there was many alliances and factions. So the Allies, which included Britain, the United States, Canada, France, Poland, Serbia, supported the White Russians in the civil war against the Red Russians, the Red Army. So they supplied equipment, training, and fought alongside White Russians. So the Russian Civil War campaign from the British perspective is a very classic example of mission creep, that the objectives were constantly changing and there was very little way to measure success. How do you know that you are winning? So initially, there was an attempt to train a White Russian army to fight and defeat the Red Army. Then it became a campaign of territorial gain, that they would continue to push down the railway and the river to gain more ground. And by the end, it was an attempt to hold the ground and withdraw without a humiliating defeat, such as had happened in other campaigns during the First World War. So the mission objectives, although ultimately was the overthrow of the government and installation of a government that would continue the war on the Eastern Front, after November 1918, that was no longer a consideration because the war was over. But Britain, principally under the stewardship of Winston Churchill as Secretary of State for War, continued a campaign in Russia with the sole purpose of overthrowing the Red Army and Lenin's Bolsheviks. So after November 1918 till as long as July 1920, the British continued in a campaign with the sole objective of overthrowing the Bolsheviks. As it transpired, the loyalty of the White Army, or some units of the White Army, was variable, to say the least, and there were significant examples of White Russian troops mutinying and murdering their British officers. And in fact, the last Australian soldier to be killed in action in the First World War was a Queenslander, Alan Brown, who was commanding White Russian troops who mutinied, and he was murdered on 20th of July 1919. Well after the First World War had ended. So he was the last Australian Imperial Force soldier to be killed in action in July 1919 in Russia, which again is very little known.
And why was there mutiny from some of the White Russian soldiers? Were they sympathetic in the end to the Bolsheviks, or were they unhappy with the involvement of the British and British Empire forces, the Imperial forces?
I think it was a matter of choosing the side that looked like they were winning. There was a bit of that. But also among the lower classes, as they were termed at the time, there was much more support for the Bolsheviks, perhaps, than the established Tsarist system, which was more associated with the officer class. There was also a shortage of fighting-age men or fighting-capable men in Russia. So the British actively recruited criminals and people not of the strongest...
The soldierly disposition.
That's a good term, soldierly disposition. So there was actually a battalion called the Slavo-British Legion, which was stragglers, deserters, criminals from jails, that the British thought that they could train and with British discipline and tactics could turn them into a effective fighting force, and they were for a time. They were an effective fighting force until 7th of July 1919. They mutinied and murdered several British officers. So, yeah, primarily the mutinies were based around the soldiers probably didn't think that the White Russians or the provisional governments in North Russia were going to win, or when it looked like they were not going to win, and they did not have any particular loyalty to a provisional government that had only existed several months anyway.
Tell me, Damien, why were the British forces sent up to northern Russia and not other parts of Russia? Was it just where there was a need, or was there a particular concentration of military activity up there?
So from the early stages of the war, or after the failure of the Gallipoli campaign, large amounts of war stores were sent from the UK to northern Russia, the ports of Murmansk and Archangel. And the Russian railway system could not handle the amount of stores being donated, so there were large warehouses set up where large amounts of war stores were kept. After Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, removing Russia from the war, some of that war equipment was being appropriated by the Bolsheviks, which the British and French did not want to allow to happen. They needed those war stores for the Western Front. So the first landing of British troops were Royal Marines and sailors in March 1918, ostensibly to guard the stores until they could be shipped back to the United Kingdom. And from there, again, mission creep, the Allies invaded Archangel in early August 1918, and from then on were actively attempting to overthrow the Bolsheviks, the local Bolsheviks in Archangel, but also the Bolsheviks across Russia by supporting the White Russian Army.
I have heard of Archangel, and I think, in occasional moments have looked it up on a map because it's extraordinarily remote. But can you describe where it is and how you would approach it?
So Archangel is named after the Archangel Michael, and also a large cathedral which stood there until the Soviets blew it up in the 1920s. So it's subarctic Russia. It's just outside of the Arctic Circle. Very long winters, very short but hot summers. It's on the White Sea, which freezes over every year. So it's inaccessible from about October until April, May. There's no access without an icebreaker. It's quite remote. It's not close to anything. And in 1919, there was not much there at all, really. A very small provincial town. The local Russians were very isolated, and it's about as remote as you can get in Russia, and a very strange environment for the British and Australian soldiers that went there, many of whom had come from France or England. In northern Russia, it was very backward in terms of its development and technology, and even the people. The people had never seen foreigners.
It must have been an extraordinary place for these Australians to end up in. They were there during one of these short, intense, hot summers. That must have taken them quite by surprise, given they were basically by the Arctic Circle.
Yes, so one of the Australians recorded in his diary that it was the hottest day when he set foot in Russia since Egypt. So he'd been in Egypt earlier in the war, and it was the hottest day that he had experienced. So because of the proximity to the Arctic Circle, the sun is very hot and intense for a short summer, which is really only 6 to 8 weeks, or 6 weeks probably for the summer. So the standard dress was shorts and shirt sleeves because it was just too hot. But conversely, during winter, it would drop to -20, -40. And so you could not actually touch the metal on a rifle without wearing gloves, or the skin would come off your fingers. So the climactic extremes was from high 30s to high 30s under the centigrade. So it's a huge variation in temperature. And the environment is very lush and green. And in summer, everything grows so quickly because whereas in winter, it's like you can get up to 23 hours of darkness. In summer, you can have 23 hours of light. Some of that is twilight, but it's still light. So everything grows very lushly and very quickly. And it was a very strange environment compared to what the British and Australian troops had been used to.
I can imagine. So back to Sergeant Samuel Pearse. He ends up in the North Russian Expeditionary Force. He's got word just before he's deployed that his very new wife is going to have a baby, which of course she duly does, and we'll come to that story a bit later. But what was his experience in this war that, of course, it led to him being awarded a Victoria Cross?
The final letter that Samuel wrote to Kitty before his death, he really writes about how much he's missing her, and I think he may have thought that he should have stayed with his wife, perhaps. Certainly, he was missing her terribly, terribly. And on 29th of August 1919, the Australians took part in an attack on a Russian artillery position. And one by one, the enemy fighting posts were knocked out. And there was one bunker left, or it was called a blockhouse, basically an above-ground bunker made of logs. It was protected by barbed wire. Samuel took some wire cutters and a bag of grenades and on his own initiative crawled forward under fire, cut through the wire, charged the blockhouse, and it's amazing that he was not hit, but he knocked out the blockhouse with grenades. And a moment later, after having believed that everyone in the blockhouse had been killed, a shot came out from the blockhouse which hit him in the thigh, and he bled to death in the arms of his mates. So he was killed by the last bullet fired in that engagement.
Oh, it's terribly unlucky. He obviously was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, and his citations stated that his magnificent bravery and utter disregard for personal danger won him the admiration of all troops at just 22 years old.
Yes, so he was posthumously recommended for the Victoria Cross, which was subsequently awarded. And when Kitty took their baby Victoria, to Buckingham Palace to receive the award, the Queen held baby Vicky, kissed her on the cheek and said how sad that the baby will grow up without her father. Vicky, was born after Samuel's death, and she was given the name Victoria Catherine Pearse to have the initials VC in honour of her father's VC. And after the war, as a war widow, Kitty travelled to Australia with baby Vicky and settled in Mildura for a time with Samuel's parents. But I think Samuel's parents expected her to live the life of a widow, but she was only 20 with an infant on the other side of the world where everything was strange and different and new. And she was quite an attractive lady and charming with her Durham accent and pale skin. And she got a lot of male attention, and eventually she married another soldier. But before that, she'd had a falling out with Samuel's parents, George and Sarah Pearse. And so having lost their son, who should have come home, he should have been home already. The war was over when he died. They also lost their granddaughter, whom they never saw again. So there's quite a bit of tragedy associated with Samuel's death in that remote Russian forest so many years ago.
Yeah, that is a very, very sad aspect to the story. But did Kitty have a good life in Australia with her new husband and obviously her Vicky?
Unfortunately not. Kitty had a very difficult time, particularly during the Depression. She had kids with her new husband, who was a bit of a rogue and not a particularly nice fellow. And Kitty was she was sent to a foster home or foster family. So both Kitty and Vicky had difficult lives post-war. So Vicky grew up not knowing who her father was. She believed that her stepfather was her father. And there's a story that Vicky recounted to me when I interviewed her many years ago now, or some years ago now, that coming up to Anzac Day, the teacher had said, has anyone got a dad that was in World War I? Anyone got a dad that was an Anzac? And Vicky stuck her hand up and said, yes, my dad was awarded the Victoria Cross. And the teacher said, that's not going to be true. At the time, there's only about 60 Australians that had been awarded the Victoria Cross. You know, you're telling tales. And she said, no, I've got the medal at home. My mum will bring it in tomorrow. So Vicky went home after school, said to her mum, Kitty, can you bring the medal in tomorrow for school for Anzac Day? It's my dad's medal. And so Vicky's waiting at school the next day and her mum doesn't come. And the teacher scolds her in front of the whole class for telling lies that her father was awarded the Victoria Cross. And a little bit later, when Vicky was about 11, she found her mother's trunk, which was always locked. It was never unlocked. Curiosity got the better of her. She went in there and she found some photographs of her mother with a young man, bundles of love letters, and the medal, the Victoria Cross medal. And she turned it over, and the name on the back was not the name of her stepfather. And that's how she worked out that her father was Samuel Pearse, because of the name on the back of the Victoria Cross medal. And she confronted her mother, and her mother admitted it. And so she didn't find out that her father was Samuel Pearse VC until she was 11. So her lifelong wish after that was to visit her father's grave. He was obviously buried in Russia after his death.
Yes, so Damien, was that normal that the soldiers would be buried in situ? I mean, obviously the Western Front has got many war graves there of Australians, but to leave these very few Australians who died in Russia, to leave them in situ?
Yeah, so it is UK government policy, which the Australian government also adopted as a signatory to the Imperial War Graves Commission, that British and Empire soldiers are buried in the country that they died. So that policy continued into Russia. Interestingly, that completely contrasts to the US government policy. When the US left northern Russia in summer 1919. They took all their casualties or known casualties with them, and then they returned again twice in the 1930s to try and find more, and they did find some more. So there are no US burials in the Archangel Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery because they were removed in 1919, whereas the British policy was to leave them there. So Samuel Pearse was buried on the battlefield by his mates in a small burial ground with a few other British casualties. And the last access to that grave was in 1927 by Imperial War Graves representative. And the location of the grave was subsequently lost and not known. So in the mid-1980s, Vicky actually got a visa for the Soviet Union. And about a week before she was due to travel there to visit her father's grave, she was advised by the Soviet embassy that the actual location of the grave was not known. So she cancelled her trip and never got to fulfill her lifelong wish to visit her father's grave in Russia. And she passed away in 2016.
But in 2018, Samuel Pearse's body is discovered, and it's quite an extraordinary story of how his remains were identified, isn't it, Damien?
Yes, so there is a remarkable battlefield historian in Archangel named Alexei Sukhanovsky, who for about 10 years was looking for the lost burial ground at Obazhskaya, where Samuel Pearse was buried. And remarkably, in summer, they found what they believed to be the graveyard. They exhumed a grave, which revealed, under forensic examination, a missing toe on the right foot, which we know Samuel was missing a toe on his right foot because he had it amputated after an injury during his Australian Army service. And a number of other indicators indicate that the remains found and exhumed and forensically examined are indeed those of Samuel Pearse.
And his slouch hat was found with his body
so
as
the
well.
Remains of the felt slouch hat were around the crown of the skull. The feet were contained in leather boots, so there was no possibility that the right foot middle toe was missing otherwise because he was buried with the boots on. By measuring the femur, they were able to determine it was Samuel Pearse's height. Also, after digging down underground, they found white stones, which were out of place for the area, and of the very few photographs, there's literally about 3 photographs of Samuel Pearse's grave. It was ringed with white stones. And also based on the map, which was drawn by the Imperial War Graves representative in the 1920s, and also an aerial photograph from 1919, cross-referencing those, there seems to be little doubt, based on the critical things that we've found, that it is in fact the remains of Australian VC hero Samuel Pearse.
Why do you think it's important that we bring Samuel Pearse home to Australia?
Well, he is one of 102 Australian Victoria Cross recipients. His medals are in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra with his photograph. Department of Veterans Affairs records him as an Australian Victoria Cross recipient. Unfortunately, Samuel's remains have been in a literal and metaphorical no man's land since they were discovered in 2018. The Australian Embassy was notified, and the Australian government has deferred responsibility for further identification to the UK authorities on the basis that Samuel was serving in the British Army at the time of his death. So that's somewhat contradictory in that Australian claims him as an Australian VC for the associated prestige and esteem, but defers all responsibility for any further action regarding his remains to the UK authorities. So the UK body that is responsible for DNA extraction and matching is the UK Ministry of Defence Joint Casualty Compassionate Centre. So not long after the remains were found, there was the invasion of Ukraine, and the same Ministry of Defence is militarily supporting Ukraine to fight Russia. So Samuel has been in a stalemate. He's in a plastic bag within a plastic crate in a government crematorium mortuary in northern Russia, where he's been held under a joint agreement with the UK Embassy in Moscow since 2019. So the Australian government refuses to take any action, deferring all responsibility to UK authorities. And the sad state of affairs is that it appears that Samuel will remain in that crate for the indefinite future because there is not the political will at the moment to negotiate any further action. And it's not just a matter of Samuel Pearse. There was another set of remains which were exhumed and forensically examined, and there's maybe 14 or 15 other Allied military burials in that same area, which is under a scrapyard. It's under debris, car parts, corrugated iron, chicken wire, and it's contaminated. So it is a national disgrace and an indignity, in my assessment, that those casualties are still there under the scrapyard, but also that Samuel Pearse and the other casualty, which has been recovered, have been sitting in crates since 2019, with the Australian government refusing to take any ownership or leadership, and the UK authorities not able to take any action because they won't compromise either, that they won't allow a third-party independent contractor to do the DNA matching. They will only permit their own Ministry of Defence team to do that. And of course, that's very sensitive for the Russian government to allow Ministry of Defence team access. Another issue is bodies are found or casualties are found on the Western Front all the time and have been since the end of the First World War. The protocols are well established and it's a very well-oiled machine as the French authorities, Belgian authorities and the UK authorities all work together. It's unprecedented in Russia for a British or Australian casualty of the First World War period to be found in Russia. It's never happened before, so there are no protocols or processes. So they would also have to be established, and memorandums of operation, and there would need to be rules and regulations set out on limitations to ensure that if UK authorities do have access, that they abide by Russian law. So there's quite a bit of work to get through to get to that point. But as I say, it's a stalemate at the moment.
And the sad reality, Damien, is that 107 years on, we're still in a position where Russia is not a friend of Australia. And so our governments can't speak to each other, through an atmosphere of peace. We are in a stage where that certainly doesn't exist between our two countries and, of course, between Britain and Russia too. Damien Wright, such an important story, a fascinating aspect of our World War I history that creeps over to Russia, and the extraordinary sacrifices of our Victoria Cross winners, the ones who are, I think, worthy of the same amount of remembrance and commemoration as the others, but are often forgotten because of the unknown nature of this involvement in the Russian Civil War. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.